You already know what a bully looks like. You've seen one. Maybe you were one. Maybe you spent years avoiding one in a hallway, a lunchroom, a parking lot. The face is familiar. The dynamic is familiar. The specific cocktail of cruelty and cowardice and social performance that makes up a proper bully is so recognizable that we tend to think of it as a modern problem. A civilization problem, something that emerged with school systems and social hierarchies and the particular pressures of living in communities of strangers. Here's the question nobody seems to ask. What if it's older than civilization itself? What if the same dynamic that made your stomach drop when someone pointed and laughed was already operating on the African savannah 100,000 years ago, around a fire in the dark, among people who had never heard of a school and had no word for what they were doing? The answer goes much further back than you think. And it starts not with humans at all. It starts with a chimpanzee named Yerowin. Before the science, a scene. Call him something like Wrath. A man in a hunter-gatherer group of about 30 people, somewhere in what is now sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. Wrath is a good hunter. He knows it. Over the course of several months, he starts making a habit of taking the choicest cuts of meat before they're distributed. Small infractions at first, then larger ones. Then he begins speaking over the older men in group decisions. One morning, a successful hunt comes back. Wrath moves toward the carcass first, the way he always does now. And this time, nobody follows his lead. Instead, two of the other hunters loudly begin discussing, within earshot of everyone, how Wrath's throw yesterday was slightly off. How he almost missed. How he's been a bit slow lately. The story grows. It gets funnier with each retelling. By nightfall, Wrath is a punchline. He stops taking the best cuts. He stops speaking over the elders. The social correction worked. Remember that scene. Because by the end of this video, it will look like something very different from what it appears to be right now. Most people picture ancient human life as too brutal and too focused on survival for anything as subtle as bullying to exist. The working assumption is something like this. When you are fighting off predators and hunting for food and trying not to die of a minor infection, you don't have time for social cruelty. Bullying is a luxury behavior, something that happens when life is comfortable enough for people to be mean instead of just scared. That assumption is wrong, almost completely. What the evidence actually shows is the opposite. Social cruelty is not a product of comfort. It is one of the oldest tools in the primate social repertoire. It predates language. It predates fire. It predates everything we normally think of as the ingredients of human society. The patterns that drive it were already operating millions of years before anyone built a school. Yerowin was a chimpanzee studied by Frans de Waal at a research facility in the Netherlands, starting in the late 1970s. De Waal spent years documenting what chimpanzees actually did with their social lives, and what he found shook the field of primatology. Chimpanzees don't just fight for status, they scheme for it. They form coalitions, they trade favors. They support one ally against another, and withdraw support as conditions change. And they enforce social norms through collective pressure. The group turns against individuals who break the rules, loudly, visibly, in ways designed to be witnessed. Yerowin lost his dominant position not through a single fight, but through a slow, coordinated campaign of social isolation by two younger males working in concert. That is not random aggression. That is politics. And it is the same fundamental behavior as bullying, operating through the same process, toward the same social ends, in a species whose lineage diverged from ours approximately 6 million years ago. Here's what that means. The behavioral circuitry for social cruelty did not appear with civilization. It did not appear with humans. We inherited it from ancestors who were already using it before we existed. Which also means that every attempt to explain bullying as a product of specific modern conditions, social media, urban anonymity, competitive academic environments, is addressing a new variable feeding into a very old system. The system itself has been running in more or less the same configuration for millions of years. You cannot delete it with a policy. You can only manage it, redirect it, understand it well enough to see it coming. That requires knowing what it actually is. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying hunter-gatherer societies, both living ones and reconstructed historical ones, and he arrived at a finding that changes the entire frame of this discussion. Hunter-gatherer groups are not egalitarian because their members are naturally equal. They are egalitarian because they actively enforce equality. Through mockery, through gossip, through social exclusion, through collective pressure applied to anyone who starts acting like they're more important than everyone else. Boehm called this reverse dominance hierarchy. The The group uses dominance behavior against anyone who tries to dominate, which means that in ancient human societies, social cruelty was not just present. It was organized. It was a governance mechanism. The bully and the policing mechanism were in many cases the same behavior aimed at different targets for different reasons. This is the part that rewrites the Wrath story. When those hunters began mocking him, they were not simply being cruel. They were doing something the group needed them to do. They were correcting an imbalance before it became a threat to everyone's survival. In a group of 30 people sharing scarce resources, one person consistently taking more than their share was not a minor social friction. It was a structural problem. The mockery was the solution, which does not mean it felt different to Wrath than it would feel to you. Social pain is social pain regardless of whether the people inflicting it have a good reason. Gossip is the mechanism that holds all of this together, and it is far older than writing or formal language. Robin Dunbar proposed that human language itself evolved primarily as a group bonding mechanism. Chimpanzees maintain social bonds through physical grooming, which takes time and requires proximity. Humans found a way to bond at scale, maintaining connections with many individuals simultaneously through talk, through story, through the exchange of information about what other people are doing and whether they should be trusted. Gossip is not a flaw in human social architecture. It is one of the founding features. And gossip is also, depending on its content and direction, one of the primary delivery systems of social cruelty. The story that spreads through a group about someone's failure, someone's transgression, someone's difference, is collective social pressure delivered through language. It scales. And it can reach people who were not present for the original incident. A bruise heals. A reputation in a small group where everyone knows everyone does not. This asymmetry is not accidental. Physical injuries heal because the body has repair mechanisms optimized over millions of years of selection pressure. Reputation damage in a small community persists because the information, once distributed, lives in other people's memories. You cannot reach in and remove it. You can only wait for it to be overwritten by new information. In a group of 150 people with no exit option and no outside reference point, that could take years, or it could never happen at all. Think about how small that group was. For most of human evolutionary history, the relevant social universe was roughly 150 people. 150 people. No strangers to escape into, no other school to transfer to, no city to disappear in. If your reputation in that group was destroyed, it was destroyed completely. There was no elsewhere. The same faces, every morning, for the rest of your life. But here is where it gets significantly more uncomfortable. Not everyone who was targeted by this mechanism had done something wrong. Some were targeted for being different in ways they could not control, and the archaeological record has preserved evidence of what happened to those people, which is more complex and more morally troubling than either the optimistic or pessimistic versions of ancient human behavior suggest. Eric Trinkhaus, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying Pleistocene human remains, published research in 2018 documenting something remarkable. The fossil record of ancient humans contains a striking number of individuals with significant physical abnormalities and developmental differences. Skeletal remains with healed fractures indicating survival over years. Individuals with conditions that would have significantly impaired their mobility or their ability to hunt. People who, by any straightforward survival calculation, should not have survived long enough to become fossils. But they did survive. In some cases, for years or decades, which means the group kept them alive, carried them, fed them, protected them. The ancient human capacity for cruelty and the ancient human capacity for care existed in the same groups, around the same fires, at the same time. The question of who received which was almost certainly determined by the same social logic that governs these things now. Relationship. Prior history with the group. The presence or absence of allies. The individual who was different but known. Who had contributed before the injury or the illness. Who had people in the group who felt the pull of obligation was more likely to be cared for. The stranger. The newcomer. The person without a coalition. Without a history. Without anyone who owed them anything was more likely to be pushed out. This is not a specifically ancient human dynamic. This is a human dynamic. The archaeology just shows us how old it is. Features do not care about justice. The same mechanism that correctly identified a genuine threat to group cohesion would fire, with equal force, on a person who was simply different, who was slow to speak, or moved in an unusual way, or showed grief differently from everyone else. Richard Wrangham, in his work on human evolution and violence, described the mechanism of reactive aggression as one of the most conserved behaviors in the human repertoire. Fast, socially amplified, difficult to interrupt once initiated. In a small group where a single genuinely dangerous individual could compromise everyone's survival, this quick and collective social response was not a bug, it was a feature. But features do not ask whether the target deserves it. The trigger does not distinguish between someone who is threatening the group and someone who is merely unfamiliar. It fires on both, and the person on the receiving end experiences both as identical. Now, a different scene. A woman, perhaps in her late 30s by the standards of her time, which made her among the elders of the group. Call her something like Sura. She has been a reliable member of the group for 2 decades. She knows where the water sources are during dry seasons. She knows which plants cause stomach illness. She has helped raise children who are not her own. But over the past few months, something has shifted. A younger woman in the group has begun to subtly undercut Sura's standing. Nothing direct. A small correction to one of Sura's observations, made in front of others. A story told about a decision Sura made years ago that turned out badly, told lightly, with humor, in a way that could be denied as malicious. The gradual withdrawal of the small daily courtesies that signal respect. Sura is not unaware of what is happening. She has done this herself, to others, in the past. She knows the mechanics of it. The question is whether her coalition is strong enough to weather it. Whether the relationships she has built over 20 years are more durable than the new alliances forming around her. This is not a story about weakness or innocence. This is politics, as old as the species. And the cognitive demands of navigating it were enormous. In a group of 150 people with no exit option, every member was simultaneously managing their own position, monitoring the positions of others, forming and maintaining alliances, and watching constantly for the signals that indicated they were being discussed in their absence. Some researchers have argued that this constant monitoring pressure was itself one of the drivers of the expansion of human cognitive capacity. The brain that could track 150 social relationships, their histories, their current status, their likely trajectories, survived better than one that could not. The cognitive capacity to understand someone well enough to undercut them effectively and the cognitive capacity to empathize with them deeply may be the same capacity, pointed in different directions. The overlap between what we call bullying and what we call politics and what we call social enforcement has never been cleanly resolved. We impose a moral clarity on the category of bullying that would not have mapped neatly onto ancient separate realities, where the target of collective pressure was often someone who was genuinely threatening group cohesion. The behavior of excluding, mocking, and freezing out feels identical from the inside, whether it is aimed at someone who deserves social correction or someone who is simply inconvenient to the people in power. Ancient humans would not have been any better than modern ones at knowing which situation they were in. They would have told themselves, just as modern ones do, that the person being mocked had it coming. The self-justifying narrative around social aggression is as old as the behavior itself. The people at the edge of the group, the ones the mechanism targeted incorrectly, the ones whose difference was not a threat but simply a difference, are the invisible population of this history. We have the bones of people who were kept alive despite serious disability. We do not have the bones of the people who were pushed out and died alone. The archaeological record is, by its nature, a record of the people who were included. The excluded left fewer traces. Their absence from the fossil record is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that survival required membership, and membership had conditions. Those conditions were enforced by the same architecture we are still running today. What the archaeological record cannot tell us, and probably never will, is the individual experience of the people on the receiving end. The fossil record preserves the bones of people who were cared for through illness and injury. It does not preserve the experience of the people who were quietly pushed to the edge of the group and left there, who shared the fire but not the warmth, who were present in the group but absent from the social fabric. These people existed. They left no testimony. The most we can say is that the same brain that was wired to experience social pain was present in their skulls. And the research on exclusion shows that the brain processes it through some of the same neural pathways it uses for physical pain. That is not a metaphor. That response was already operational long before the first city was built. The bully was not just making someone feel bad, in the right season at the wrong moment in the group's dynamics. The bully was wielding something considerably heavier than embarrassment. That last sentence is worth sitting with. The group was survival. Being pushed to the edge of it was not a metaphorical risk. It was sometimes a real and proximate threat to continued existence. Your body still treats social rejection as a survival signal, because for most of human existence, It was 1. The next time you feel the particular quality of shame that comes from being publicly mocked, or the cold specific anxiety of knowing that people you depend on are talking about you in your absence, pay attention to what it feels like physically. The tightening, the heat, the involuntary review of every possible thing you might have done wrong. That is not a learned response. That is not produced by civilization or technology or the specific cruelties of institutional life. It is produced by a nervous system calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years to treat that exact information as urgent. You are built to feel it that way because the people who felt it that way and responded quickly survived longer than the people who did not. There is a broader pattern in all of this that is easy to miss when you focus on individual cases. We keep trying to locate bullying in a specific context, a specific institution, a specific technology, a specific era of particularly pronounced social cruelty. And every time we locate it somewhere specific, it turns out to have been present in the previous era too. And the one before that, and the one before that. The research on aggression in children shows that deliberate cruelty targeted at specific individuals, motivated at least partly by the distress response it produces, appears before the age of 3. It does not need to be taught. It does not require exposure to violent media or competitive academic environments. It emerges from the same developmental process that produces empathy, theory of mind, and the capacity for deep social bonding. These are not separate systems that sometimes malfunction. They are expressions of the same underlying architecture. The capacity to understand someone else's inner state well enough to connect with them is the same capacity that makes it possible to understand exactly what will hurt them most. Ancient humans had both. We have both. This has always been the deal. What makes the ancient context clarifying rather than simply depressing is the scale of it. 150 people, no exit. The same fire every night. In that context, every act of social cruelty and every act of care happened in full view of everyone whose opinion mattered to your survival. There was no private cruelty and no private kindness. Everything was witnessed. Everything was remembered, which means the feedback loop was immediate and total in a way that modern life rarely produces. The person who was cruel yesterday had to face the person they were cruel to this morning. The person who was excluded had to sit near their excluders at the fire tonight. There was no blocking, no unfollowing, no algorithm separating people into separate social realities. Just the fire, and everyone around it, carrying the full weight of what had happened between them. Whether that made ancient social life more brutal or more honest than our own is a question that probably has no clean answer. It may have been both simultaneously. Somewhere 50,000 years ago, Wrath probably believed everyone had suddenly turned against him for no reason. He could never have known he was caught inside one of the oldest patterns our species ever evolved. Neither could Sura. Neither could the person at the edge of the fire who left no name and no bones. They just lived it. Ancient humans sat around the same fires we now light at campsites on vacation. They felt cold and tried to get closer. They shared food and noticed who didn't share back. They laughed at the person who tripped and then helped them up, and then told the story for 3 weeks. They were not noble savages untouched by cruelty. They were not brutish monsters incapable of kindness. They were people. Complicated, contradictory, capable of extraordinary care and casual cruelty, sometimes within the same afternoon. The fire is not ancient history. The fire is us. If this changed how you see the person in the next room, leave a comment and tell me what you noticed. And subscribe, because next week we go somewhere else in the social machinery of ancient humans, and what we find there makes the bully look like the simplest character in the story.